What is a fairy tale? We all know what fairy tales are, right? Right? When I posed this question to different people, I got wildly different answers from the people that I asked. The English teacher in me wants to define a fairy tale as a short mythical story that exists primarily to provide a lesson to the reader and listeners. But I don't like that definition. Those that I asked just called fairy tales mythical stories that have a good moral. And to some extent, I like that more than my own opinion, but I also think this is too broad. Academic articles discussing literary terms describe fairy tales as important because they spark as imagination, they give us an outlet for experiencing things in our minds before we experience them in the real world. It is where the troubles of the real world can meet the supernatural and mix things up, which I do think is getting closer. In combining the previous definitions, we are going to work with the definition of fairy tales as stories we tell children to inspire them into having hope. I'm not saying that adults cannot enjoy fairy tales, because I am very much so an adult, and I very much so enjoy fairy tales. But what I am saying is that adults are not the audience that the creator has in mind when they are making fairy tales. Adults cannot get as much out of fairy tales as adults, because they were stories that were not made for us. Fairy tales are made to teach us how to be good and decent people, and those are things that hopefully every adult has learned by the time they have reached that age. Fairy tales all follow the same basic premise that most stories do, but with one key difference. The character starts out 1, with a simple world, 2, their world is upended and they are presented with a change. Then 3, and the key difference, they overcome that obstacle through good moral character. This is different from other stories, as just 2 examples. In Transformers, the Transformers overcome the obstacle via their own strength. In Sherlock Holmes, he overcomes his obstacles through his own intelligence. But in fairy tales are different because it's the action of good moral character that allows the people in the stories to overcome the obstacles in their way. Then, of course, fourth and finally, having learned the power of good moral character, the story resolves itself. Working under this assumption, there was a story that I read as a young adult, and continue to read to this day to inspire me as I continue creating. It is called The Little Prince, by French author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Do not ask me to say that name again, or pronounce it correctly, because neither of those things are going to happen for the rest of this video. The Little Prince, much like many other fairy tales, is a story about growing up. But more specifically, it is a story about the dangers of losing your childhood after you have grown up. Side note, I am talking explicitly about the book, but I am going to be using clips from the 2015 Netflix movie. The book asks a lot of open-ended questions towards adult, and it opens with one of those questions, asking, is this a hat? Or is it, as the narrator tells us, a boa constrictor eating an elephant? If you are a boring old adult, of course, you will see a hat. But the magic of being a child is in seeing the boa constrictor. The child, fed up with the adults, draws another, showing the inside of the snake eating the elephant. Now, this child grows up entering into part 1 of the story, and he is told to learn more helpful things, and so he does. He learns more helpful things and he becomes a pilot, although clearly not a very good pilot, as he crashes into the desert. Well, in the desert, the pilot meets a young boy who appeared from seemingly nowhere. The pilot and the boy spend time together in the desert, and slowly the boy begins to open up to the pilot and tell him of his journey across the stars he's undertaken. For the boy is the Little Prince who lived on a planet so small that he could watch as many sunsets and sunrises as he wanted. On his planet, he would sweep out his small volcanoes and dig up the weeds. But above all else on the planet, the Little Prince loved his rose. For the rose was the only flower on his entire planet, and while the rose was very beautiful, it was also very arrogant. So eventually, the Little Prince grew tired of the rose's constant demands on his time and on his person, and he left his planet behind. Leaving his safe home, the Little Prince steps out into danger. The Little Prince stumbles onto a strange planet. On this planet is a king who says that he rules over the entire universe, but his planet is completely empty other than himself. This is a king a king without subjects. When the little prince grows tired of being bossed around, he decides to leave, and then the king orders him to leave so he can still feel in charge. On the second planet, the little prince finds a clown, a man who just wants to be praised and lives for no other reason, but now lives alone in space. The little prince does not feel like clapping for the man, and so continues on. On the third planet, we find a drunk who drinks to forget the shame of drinking. The little prince does not stay long. On the fourth planet, we are shown a businessman who buys up stars and keeps track of the stars he's bought. The man keeping and buying stars while never once even bothering to look up from his desk and the papers of the very stars he supposedly bought. The man becomes irate at the little prince's continued presence on his planet, as after many years of buying stars, he's never been interrupted this long. The man sits and buys stars without ever actually truly owning them. On the fifth planet, the little prince finds a lamplighter, a planet so small that a full day lasts just a minute, so every 30 seconds the lamplighter must light the lamp for the 30 seconds of night, and then extinguish it again for the 30 seconds later at the break of day. Then the lamplighter must wait for the 30 seconds of day and light the lamp again for the night. And so the lamplighter has been doing this for many days. He's wasted away an entire lifetime lighting and extinguishing his useless lamp. And so the little prince also takes his leave from that planet. On the sixth planet, the little prince meets an elderly geographer, a map maker who has never been anywhere. A man who wanted to explore the universe but instead was too afraid to actually leave his planet, and so never actually got to explore the universe. The map maker asked the little prince to explore and bring back reports of what the rest of the universe is like. The little prince agrees, saddened for the man that he refuses to leave and actually experience life. And so the little prince picks up and resumes his journey. The little prince meets a lot of very different kinds of adults on his journey. Each is different in their own way, but they all share the same problem. They have lost hope in their own future. It all comes back to hope that forces all of them to stay on their little planet rather than seizing the opportunities and life that they still have. That is what this section of the book exists to highlight. It is that we choose our own fate. We choose to have hope. But really, that is the purpose of all fairy tales. It is to teach some kind of lesson to the reader. Personal hope and good moral character are at the heart of all fairy tales, and we are only at the halfway mark of The Little Prince right now. These are two key components of good moral character that all fairy tales have, and all of these stories kind of have together. Fairy tales have always had this structure, and to understand this a little bit better, let's look back at what was originally a very old fairy tale, and now is a kind of old movie. When you hear the word fairy tale, what movie pops into your head? Because I know for me, it has always been Snow White. Fairy tales are much, much older than the story of Snow White, but I think it is a good example of a classic fairy tale that many of us understand the genre to be. The Disney adaptation of Snow White is not the original version of the story. It is very far from it. But I still think it says a lot, because of the impact that Disney as a studio has had on our very understanding of culture as a whole. And this movie that would start it all. If it was not for this original movie, Disney as a movie studio might never exist. So let's explore that version of an old fairy tale for the sake of brevity as an example of so many other kinds of fairy tales in the genre. The movie opens with Snow White cleaning the Queen's palace. This very quickly devolves as the evil Queen becomes jealous of Snow White. She sends out the huntsman to kill Snow White while she's out in the woods, but he is unable to do so, feeling too guilty about it, and Snow White runs off into the wilderness. Here we see Snow White's unending kindness and gentleness that gets her through every situation. At first she befriends the woodland animals and then the dwarves, who quickly see her as a trusted friend. And with the dwarves she finds refuge, at least for a while. Snow White is then tricked by the old witch, she eats a poisoned apple and falls into a deep sleep. The dwarves do not bury her like the evil queen had expected. They are not willing to give up on their friend now, not after all that she has done for them. Snow White survives because of the kindness she has treated her friends with, so that in her time of need, there are people who are there for her. Snow White's curse is broken by a true love's kiss, and well, kind of questionable now, the audience is supposed to understand that love, true love, conquers all. True unconditional love between two people is a superior moral quality. True unconditional love is the quality that this movie wants us to display. And with Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs, and Prince Charming, they all live happily ever after. Little fun fact, the first time I ever actually watched Snow White is actually when I watched it to make this video. That is how important I know this movie was. Side note, from my side note, nothing happens in this movie. It's not a good movie, but I think it is still a good example of a fairy tale even if nothing actually happens in this movie. I swear you could get like a 25-minute version of this movie and it would hit all of the points people remember. There's like 50 minutes in the middle where the plot does not advance or change at all. Continuing on with the main video. Snow White did not play a role in my childhood at all. It did contribute personally to my understanding of fairy tales, but I know this was the benchmark of the stories that were told for children for generations. Because not Snow White specifically, but these kinds of stories are so fundamental to us as a culture. When we are growing up, we tend to learn a lot. This is not just because we are often experiencing the world for the first time, but it also has to do with our own brain chemistry. A very interesting skill children do not develop until shortly before they are 10 years of age, depending on the child, is the ability to understand conservation. Jean Piaget, a well-known developmental psychologist, noticed this characteristic among children. Now, what is conservation, and what does it have to do with fairy tales? And we'll get there in a second. But what conservation is the ability to understand spatial reasoning of all kinds. An example of what this looks like is if you were to give a child who does not have conservation yet, let's say 2 cookies on 2 separate plates, but now they have to choose between one of the 2 plates with cookies on it. Most children would just pick at random. However, if you split one of the cookies in half, even in front of their eyes, they will pick up the 2 halves and claim that they are in fact getting more cookie. The volume of the cookie has not changed. It is the exact same amount of cookie, but because it is now numerically 2, the child believes that they are getting twice as much cookie, despite the fact that is not true. Piaget, when doing this experiment with multiple children under the age of 10, got very similar, if not identical, results. Some children do develop faster than others, and so have this skill much earlier. But it is a skill that our brains need to develop into. It is not something that we are born with. Spatial reasoning and deduction are things that have to be learned by us over time. So what do the rules of conservation have to do with Snow White? And it is this. Our basic understanding of morals is not found via our biology, because our biology is inherently self-centered. Our bodies exist fundamentally to keep themselves alive. Overriding that takes moral character. Doing anything that is beneficial to others, especially at a cost to yourself, is a defiance of your own nature. And if you've worked or lived with small children, you would know that all too well. Because small children are freaking selfish. Don't let their cuteness and random acts of kindness deceive you. All children are monsters. Every single one of them are all monsters. Our stories like Snow White, our myths, are how we tell and instill culture and moral value into children. We are born selfish. We choose to be selfless. Stories like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs exist to show us as children that things like selflessness, kindness, being gentle with people and animals, and unconditional love are all positive traits. These are things that we want to emulate. Fairy tales are not as directly called fairy tales as they once were, but you would also be mistaken to believe that fairy tales are not still very much so a part of our current culture. Understanding the stories we tell one another, fairy tales are not just something that existed in the 30s and then fizzled out. No, we are still very much so making fairy tales. And to highlight the fact that we are still very much so telling fairy tales, and they are still very much so a part of the stories we tell, let's look at the 2021 movie, Luca. Luca is a small movie about a small dream that, through heartfelt compassion, looms large in my mind as one of the best of what a modern fairy tale can be. But why am I comparing this Pixar film to a fairy tale? And let's look at its structure to see why. The movie opens showing us, Luca's regular life under the sea. We get to see him and his longing for a different world. This is something his parents are terrified of. Under no circumstance do they want their child going to the surface. But Luca does so anyway, and while he is up there he runs into Alberto, another one of his kind. Luca marvels at all of the human objects Alberto has, and the two of them quickly become friends and fall in love with Vespa, and they start building their own Vespa out of junk and playing with it. Luca's parents discover this and quickly move to send him into the deep ocean where they know nothing can harm him. This of course angers Luca, who does not want to go to the dark world down below and would instead rather go to the surface world. And so he runs away, finds Alberto, and the two of them go to the surface town. Luca and Alberto start to explore the town. They are unfamiliar with the land of humans, and almost fall into water and get discovered several times, because if they are wet, they look like sea monsters, if they're dry, they look like people. The pair find an actual real Vespa for sale, and also learn of a local triathlon that would give them enough money to buy the Vespa. They find a young local girl named Julia, who also wants to earn the money from the triathlon. The trio quickly become friends. Julia invites them over to her house to have a sleepover in her treehouse. The pair learn that Julia's father is a fisherman and a sea monster hunter. Alberto, while they are there, enjoys spending time with Julia's father, and Luca falls deeper in love with the human world. But the joy is short-lived, as when they are out together, Julia discovers that Alberto is a sea monster, and instead of sticking up and with his friend, Luca pretends that he did not know either, so that he can stay with Julia. This breaks Alberto's heart, and he departs. However, Julia is not stupid, and rightly guesses Luca is also a sea monster. Luca goes looking for Alberto and finds that Alberto is in his hiding place, and it is trashed. Luca chooses to show remorse for what he did and asks for forgiveness. Luca learns that Alberto's parents abandoned him. He then apologizes and promises that he will win the Vespa and repair their friendship. And so Luca shows kindness and self-sacrifice and sets off to go and win the triathlon alone. Doing this by himself actually goes fairly well. He seems like he's in a real chance of winning the race, as he does the eating and swimming really well. But as he reaches the top of the hill on his bike, a rain cloud comes in, and if he goes out into the water, the whole world would know that he is a sea monster. But at the last minute, Alberto shows up with an umbrella, which allows Luca to stay out of the water. Alberto chooses to show kindness and self-sacrifice by coming back. Luca sets off down the hill, and another child attempts to stop him. The other child, Urkel, knocks the umbrella out of his hand, and Luca is revealed to the world as a sea monster. Urkel attempts to attack him, but Julia chooses to give up on her own dreams and show kindness by self-sacrificing her own race in order to knock Urkel over, allowing Luca to win the race. So it did in the end take all three of them acting as a team in order to win the race. The town embraces both of them. Alberto decides to stay with Julia's father and fish with him. Luca and Julia set off to go to school, leaving behind a town that now embraces sea monsters, leaving behind a better world. It was the summer of 2020. I was done with high school. I would never have to go back again. And it was in the middle of a global pandemic, so I was cut off from all of my friends at the time, not that I really talked to them much anyway. So that summer, other than my family, I was largely alone, and it being in the middle of a global pandemic, I spent as much time outside as I possibly could. It was a strange summer, one that passed by seemingly in a blur, but the lessons I learned that summer, I've continued to carry with me for a lifetime. Throughout the time, I learned the value of being busy and of being still. Because there was nothing to do, I very quickly grew bored, so I needed to find things to do that would keep me busy. Because one of the things that I learned about myself during that time was that I have to have a goal. Having that goal allowed me to drive forward. It gave purpose back into my life, and I was no longer just somebody sitting around letting the world happen to me. Having a goal pushed me forward, and my goal for a lot of that summer was finishing writing a book. And I did it. You could often find me throughout that entire summer sitting outside under a tree in the grass in a hammock, writing obsessively. And I did finish that book, and it gave me purpose. So what does that have to do with fairy tales and with Luca? And this is what it has to do. We need to work hard for what we have. What we dream for matters. Caring about and for other people, even when it is hard, matters, and how we try to achieve that dream matters. In the movie, Luca makes a terrible decision to betray his friend, and it backfires. It takes self-sacrifice and kindness for the trio to actually be able to win the race. That is what is at the core of the good moral character of this film. The self-sacrifice and kindness are important. They matter, and they are things that we should do. Fairy tales are not an outdated relic of the past. Stories that exist simply to pass along a simple good message are still important. The stories we learn, especially as children, matter. They are important because the stories that we are told shape us into who we will be for the rest of our lives, and to show how much the stories we tell one another affect us. Let's go back and finish The Little Prince. The Little Prince begins to describe the last half of his journey, the time when he has reached Earth, and has met so many new people and animals. It is here on the Earth that the Little Prince meets the titular pilot, who we have known since the start of the book. The Little Prince reaches Earth, but lands in the desert. The first person that he finds there is a snake who says that he can bring the Little Prince home, if the prince allows himself to be bitten by that snake. The Little Prince, for now, declines and continues on. In the desert, the prince finds a bed of roses. So many roses. And he despairs. For he believed that the rose on his planet was absolutely unique and one of a kind. But now he's learned that there are so many other roses, exactly like the rose that he loved. But as he's despairing, a fox comes along and tells him he wishes to be tamed. The Little Prince does not know how to tame a fox, and so the fox teaches him, and in so doing becomes a unique fox, because no other fox has been tamed by the Little Prince but that one particular fox. And with that, the fox departs, and the Little Prince realizes that his flower is absolutely unique, because it is his flower. The Little Prince soon finds the pilot, and the two find a well together and are able to drink for the first time in a long time. And the Little Prince continues to tell the pilot of all of his adventures. After so much time together in the desert, the pilot has grown attached to the Little Prince. But the Little Prince longs to go back home, and so he tells the pilot to stay behind, as he's going to go find the snake. The pilot attempts to stop him, and fails. The snake bites the Little Prince, and he falls to the ground. But by the next morning, the body of the Little Prince cannot be found. Clearly, the pilot escaped shortly after this, as he was able to write this book. And with the pilot looking up to the stars and wishing to know that the Little Prince is still up there, is where the story ends. But for me, that story, that message continued on long after the end of the book. When I was young, a family member passed away very suddenly. It was unexpected and no one saw it coming. It shattered my family. And I have seen a lot in my life since then. I have been through a lot of experiences that have been very bad. But by far, the loss of a loved one was by far the hardest thing that I have ever been through. And a big part of the reason why it is so hard was it threw everything into question I had held as a fact. Suddenly, the unquestionable fact that all life has intrinsic value was in question. Because how can life have intrinsic value when it is able to be snuffed out so easily? Why does anything we do matter when we know that everyone we love will die? Why does our life matter? The Little Prince ends in a tragedy, doesn't it? He's bitten by the snake that should kill him, right? Can it be a fairy tale if this is how it ends? Yes. Yes, it can. Because sometimes life is suffering, despite whatever we try and do about it. But what we do matters, and that is what every single character in The Little Prince highlights. Character after character was too consumed with one thing to actually live. The pilot was too consumed with his plane to actually see the beauty in the world around him. It wasn't until the Little Prince showed up and pointed it out to him that the pilot began to see how beautiful and how truly wonderful the world actually was. I was recently reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, a psychologist who survived the horrors of the Holocaust, and he said something within those pages that has stuck with me. He said, with his, he referring to anyone in general, loss of belief in the future. He has also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and become subject to the mental and physical decay. Having belief in the future is what we call hope. Hope, above all, is the currency of our species. Without hope, we are lost into meaningless. You have to hope and believe in something. You have to hope that you will be here tomorrow in order to actually do anything. The little prince hoped in his flower. He hoped that he would be able to return to the stars, and he hoped that he would one day be able to again look upon those sunrises on his planet and be with his flower. Hope is something that, as Frankl is oh so right about, extends beyond circumstances and into reality. The little prince literally left behind his entire world in order to set out on a mission to look for some kind of hope, and in the end he found it, and he returned to the stars and his flower. Hope is so incredibly important. I hope in my faith, and I hope you believe in something too. You might not have a name for it right now, but you are still here, living, and that means so much, because without hope, our life becomes meaningless. Hope can, in so many small ways, and so many different variables, be found, because hope is not something that happens to us, it is a decision that we make. And the stories that we tell each other, the fairy tales that we grew up with, can help us see and understand that hope is a choice that we can make, that good moral character and the good things that we do throughout our life matter. They are important and things that we should do for the sake of doing them, because they are important. How you live and the kind of person you are is important. And I hope all of you know that you are important. And so, as always, good night, good luck, and don't get lost.